So hi, and welcome to the fourth session in our Prosper with webinar series. This series is organized by SDG Impact Jordan, which is an initiative of the UNDP. And just very briefly, it focuses on mobilizing capital towards businesses that are contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Rasha Manna, and I lead this initiative. As many of you know, this webinar series is an offshoot of a conference that we'd organized to be held in Jordan earlier last month. And for obvious reasons, we've moved to the webinar format, and we've contextualized the conversation around the theme of resilience. And every week we've been looking at resilience from a different perspective. Today, we're going to be talking about how intrapreneurship and a culture of intrapreneurship can contribute to resilience, but also how it can contribute to a culture of innovation and how it can help businesses constantly disrupt themselves from within and transform to be relevant, but also very importantly, how intrapreneurship can contribute to attracting and retaining talent. I often hear from corporates in Jordan that are looking to bring in this entrepreneurial spirit into their organizations, that they find it difficult to recruit talent that is entrepreneurial minded. And I also hear very often that if they do recruit them, that they're surprised they're not able to retain them. And it's important to keep in mind with the younger generation, the Gen Zs, the millennials, that they're looking to be incentivized by more than financial reward. I want to tell you a short story that I love telling. I was at an IFC conference last year in Cape Town on the topic of the private sector role in education. And in this conference, average age probably is at least 60. And for 2 days, they're talking about youth unemployment and the need to create jobs for youth. In the closing plenary session, young man stands up, early 20s, and he says during the Q&A segment, he's just spent 2 days talking about the need to create jobs for youth. But youth aren't looking for jobs. Youth are looking for purpose. And we just heard the sad news coming out of Careem, Uber in the Middle East, that they're laying off a third of their staff. That's over 500 employees in the Middle East. And it's a tough time to be unemployed. And we're going to be hearing of more layoffs, and there is going to be a flood of talent coming into the market. But I do believe that there's still demand for top talent. My LinkedIn feed is filled with startups that are posting, directing their messages to ex-Careem, ex-Uber staff, or soon to be ex, inviting them to apply to positions in their startups. My question to the corporates is, how do you compete with that? Yes, you can afford to pay more, and yes, you'll be able to recruit some talent based on higher pay. But the question is, will you be able to retain them? And culture is key for employee retention. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So if I can invite Maggie and Faisal to turn on their videos. You know that those of you that have been with us over the past month know that we've been inviting different people to host each session. Today we've invited Faisal Bitar, who heads the Innovation Hub at the Arab Bank, and they try to really instill an entrepreneurial mindset within the bank. He also heads the AB Accelerator program. So Faisal, I'll hand over to you to start the conversation today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rasha, and welcome everyone. I want to thank SDG Impact and UNDP for really making this happen. I think it's quite vital at a time like this, where we can still transfer knowledge. For our discussion today, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Maggie De Pree is a mother and an entrepreneur who has spent over 12 years working with global corporations, entrepreneurs, to foster a market-based solution and a societal challenges, including in climate change, energy security, and healthcare. She believes in the power of human agency, the ability for people to choose to make a difference in this world. She co-founded the League of Intrapreneurs, a global movement for corporate social entrepreneurs, people inside companies driving systematic change on societal issues. For today's conversation, Maggie will start with a presentation, then we'll move into a discussion, and then a last segment of a Q&A. If you have any questions in between, please add them to the Q&A. I'm going to try my best to multitask and to throw in a couple of questions as we go. Maggie, the floor is yours.
Faisal, thank you. And Rasha, also thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Very sorry I couldn't make my first trip to Jordan, but when we are flying again, I would love to come have this conversation in person. As Faisal said, I'm just going to share my screen just with a few slides. I think sometimes with a new topic, it's helpful to tee it up with some framework so we know what we're talking about, but then we'll get into conversation and looking forward to your questions. So as Faisal said, my name is Maggie De Pree, and I co-founded what's called the League of Intrapreneurs. We're a global network of people working inside global corporations, also nonprofits and governments, but the shared journey is that they're driving change from within an existing institution. So just in terms of definition, we haven't misspelled it. It does start with an I, so the concept is an intrapreneur, somebody, an individual or team who identifies and develops entrepreneurial opportunities, ventures, solutions, new markets from within established organizations. The League and my work focuses very much on what we would call impact or social intrapreneurs. So those intrapreneurs that are focused on entrepreneurial opportunities posed by societal challenges. And I would say we're in the middle of one of our biggest societal challenges at the moment, this global pandemic. And you can just see a raft of entrepreneurial opportunities opening up from, how do we provide healthcare digitally? How do we provide education digitally? So there's kind of the digital of everything. We're looking at our food systems and how insecure, you mentioned resilience, Russia and Faisal. So, lots of lack of resilience in many of our systems. These are wonderful opportunities, not just for entrepreneurs that Rasha mentioned, but also for your employees to think about how do we create something new? How do we respond in an innovative and value creating way? And I love this quote I heard from an entrepreneur when I started my research back in 2006, is she said, really simply, an entrepreneur works from rather than for an organization. So they really see, so Faisal works for this, major bank. It's a wonderful platform for impact and change. It has all these assets, whether that's people or money or supply chains or know-how or technology. And how do I use that to look outside my organization to address issues that really matter? And I think it always helps to bring the concept of entrepreneurship to life by giving examples, telling stories. And Faisal, I hope we'll get to hear a bit more about your story as an entrepreneur in the bank. This is quite a well-known one, at least in the communities that I work with. Nick Hughes was an entrepreneur at Vodafone. I met back in kind of about 2006-07, and he is the founder of what's called M-Pesa. And basically the idea with M-Pesa is he was sitting inside Vodafone, which is a mobile phone company. And the company was looking to expand to new markets, particularly looking at sub-Saharan Africa. And what he noticed in these markets was that many of the customers that they were trying to reach didn't have access to traditional bank accounts. So they were what we might call the unbanked. They didn't have maybe birth certificates or, credit scores or know how to read or write, didn't have ways to access traditional bank accounts. So Nick saw that there was an opportunity, but they still had a need to move money around, right? So they had to pay for their food. They went to the market, they paid for a taxi. Many of them might want to send money to family in other parts of the country or the region if they were earning in one place and wanting money to move in another. So they had a financial need, but they weren't being served by the traditional banks. And Nick observed this challenge and said, well, we're a platform, right? What if we looked at our mobile phone technology as a platform for these customers or potential customers to move money around? And so that was the idea behind M-Pesa. It now serves millions of customers, not in Kenya, but around the world. And it really gave birth to this idea of the mobile phone as a platform, which we now use for digital health and all sorts of ways of providing services using mobile technology. But he was really the pioneer behind that concept. So an intrapreneur inside. And what I would say, and I know Faisal and I will get into this discussion more now, is looking back on it, we can say, oh, of course, what a great idea. And that, that should have happened. And, mobile platforms is the future. He had a very difficult time selling this in. He got no support initially, internally from the company, and had to go outside to seek initial startup capital. So he worked with the UK Development Agency. He applied to a competition, in fact, and won £1 million to be able to get this thing started. And I think, what we're going to talk more about today is mindset and culture. When I talked to Nick, one of the biggest challenges that he faced was just this entrenched mindset about what business we're in. So I work at a mobile phone company. I sell phones and I sell airtime, and that's my business. I work at a bank, I sell bank accounts or I sell investment products, so there's a fixed idea for many people of the business that we're in. And when you're an innovator, you're an entrepreneur on the inside, you're spotting these new opportunities, you're often challenging that framework for people of the business that we're in. So that was one of the main challenges for Nick, was helping people to see that, you know, we could be more than a mobile phone company. We can be a platform for access to financial services. He's now doing access to solar energy, you know, access to healthcare, all these other market opportunities. But it was that real mental shift that people had to make to come on his journey. And so, you know, why intrapreneurship and why now? I've been using this slide for a number of years, but I would say this, you know, many of these things are coming into sharp focus at the moment. You know, the first is innovation and disruption. So, you know, we're being disrupted everywhere. I mean, you know, we don't just have to look at banking, but, you know, companies are being disintermediated. We've got the Airbnbs, the Ubers. So all these kind of sharing economy and other new business models, fintech, are disrupting, you know, our incumbent companies. So are you going to disrupt or be disrupted? So that's one real important reason to be considering intrapreneurs and intrapreneurship. The second is, though, that intrapreneurs really are good at spotting kind of systems problems and really understanding the interconnectedness between your organization and the wider world. And we're seeing that right now, right? We're seeing that we no longer operate in isolation. Like, we are so interconnected as a global community, as a global economy. So, you know, what are those issues that we can invest in to make our business more resilient and to create more value, both for our organization, but also for wider society? And finally, as Rasha was saying, I mean, I love that, Rasha, how you framed it. I'm not looking for a job, I'm looking for purpose. You know, that if you want to recruit the best and brightest, what the research is showing is they not only want purpose, but they want to create something. You know, they want to tap their creative energy and they want more autonomy. So a pathway and a culture of intrapreneurship is one way to attract and retain that talent. So it really is these three things coming together. So this kind of these forces of disruption, the need to drive solutions that are systemic, address the sustainable development goals, you know, as well as this talent, kind of race for talent. And as again, Rasha said, you know, we're in a strange moment right now, but I don't think that's going to change. Younger generations are going to be looking for meaning and purpose. And if you look at the market opportunity, it's huge. You know, the Sustainable Development Commission put out that report that showed a $12 trillion market addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. So there is a way to have profit and purpose at the same time. And just quickly on this, you know, if you look at the life cycle of a company, so speaking to this disruption point, it's dropping from 75, you know, kind of on average, 75 years to 15 years today for S&P 500 companies. And if you look at this left hand of the curve, this is the growth of the organization. So many of your organizations may have started out as startups. You know, I've worked a lot, I'm based here in Portland, Oregon. Nike is our biggest company here. So you might know the story of the shoe company, you know, with Bill Bowerman, the track coach, and Phil Knight, the track runner. You know, so that was a very entrepreneurial startup. So that's on the bottom left of this curve, and they had that entrepreneurial energy, and they were selling shoes out of the back of their car at track meets. But then Nike became a company and it started to grow and grow. So you need to operationalize, you need all those systems and processes to scale your existing business model. But if you don't start shifting, then you might hit that second half of the curve. And we can think of Kodak is a great example where they didn't make the shift, or Nokia. So there's lots of stories where organizations didn't think about what is that next wave that I need to catch. What's the new business model that so I don't get disrupted? So for Nike, that's been a lot around digital, that's been around customization, that's been around fashion. And you better believe that company has intrapreneurs, which are your entrepreneurs on the inside, you know, making that leap. And it's because it's a very different thinking required. So the thinking required to grow and scale your existing business model is very different from the thinking that Faisal and his team need to do to really disrupt the business model from within. And so I would just leave us with kind of, to set up the conversation, Faisal, like, what is the thinking? You know, what, like, how is it different? And we've done a lot of research with this, as have partners of ours, looking at how do we articulate the intrapreneur's mindset. We have a tool called the League IQ, which people can take to kind of assess how intrapreneurial they are. And I think the one thing that I've learned through the process is that we don't want to pit people against each other. It's not either or. You need both in an organization. People talk about ambidextrous organizations. You do need people who are very good at managing for certainty, you know, at making sure the trains run on time. But if you're going to stay in business over the long term, if you're going to adapt and be able to get out in front, or at least respond to some of these threats that are coming at your organization, you need to also have that other part of your business that's more entrepreneurial. So you need both, but this is to distinguish the intrapreneur's mindset, you know, perhaps from more traditional management. And I would say first, intrapreneurs start with a need, you know, and this is just good business, you know, focus on the customer, focus on the community need. I think sometimes we get so focused on the message, the marketing message or the margin, that we lose sight of, are we really solving a problem that needs solving? So that's the starting point. And that requires a lot of getting people out of the office, you know, getting out from behind your desk. The second, though, is like once you spot that need as an intrapreneur, you need to connect it back with what the company cares about. So in Nick Hughes' case, they cared about growth markets. You know, they may not have cared about the unbanked necessarily as a customer segment, but they cared about sub-Saharan Africa as a growth market. So it's how you make that business case for addressing that wider community need. The third kind of component of an intrapreneur's mindset, you know, is spotting patterns. Intrapreneurs are very good at making these unlikely connections. They're very well networked, both within but also outside the organization. So they often talk about being an insider and outsider. So when you're looking for intrapreneurs or you're looking to bring people in, those external networks are incredibly important because they're going to be spotting trends that today can become really relevant. So things like the sharing economy, you know, 10, 15 years ago, intrapreneurs knew that was going on, you know, where the most of your organization might not have known. And they could have said, this is relevant for you. So really getting those people that are able to make those connections to your business ahead of time. You know, do it to prove it. So intrapreneurs, like, and an intrapreneur's mindset, if you're looking to cultivate this in your organization, it's encouraging people to try stuff, to test stuff, to experiment. And I think this is one of the challenges with big companies, is that we often can get lost in our marketing departments for 6 months or 6 years before actually going and talking to a customer or trying out a prototype. This is what entrepreneurs are very good at, because we don't have big, you know, marketing and research and development budgets. So we just have to get out and try things. You know, there's lots of now tools around this, minimum viable products, lean, agile. So hopefully you'll, you know, be able to access it, but the intrapreneurs just do it to prove it. And they also know that a prototype, having an actual thing, is easier to sell than just selling an idea. And the last thing I would say, you know, when we think about the intrapreneur's mindset, is that they leave their ego at the door. Not everybody, but by and large, the most successful intrapreneurs have a way of making this not about them, but about the idea and about inviting other people to own it. You know, and so I've heard from intrapreneurs that you know, the success of their projects often came when other people took ownership of it. And sometimes they had to let go. Sometimes it was hard. But if you really are looking at impact, you have to invite other people in along the journey. So that can't be about you. It can't be about your career trajectory. It really needs to be about, like, how do I enroll other people in seeing the possibility and giving them a stake in this idea? So I think that's basically what I would leave it with. And I was really inspired when I heard the vice chairman and chief scientific officer at PepsiCo speak a couple of years ago, where he said, look, you know we need more purpose in our organizations. We've aligned around the sustainable development goals. We've got the what, or the, you know, we're kind of past the should we, but there's this question of how do we do it? And a key component for any organization is going to be your intrapreneurs.
Great, thank you, Maggie. To start on and to develop more into the points that you made, and starting with spotting the opportunities, I think that is quite vital, because, you know, if your business is not willing to adapt to this changing circumstances, you know, like you said, someone else will be more than happy to take your place in the market. So on that, and what we're seeing today with these unprecedented changes in COVID-19, you know, I'm seeing a lot of organizations talk about digital transformation. But I think one thing we need to talk about digital transformation is separating digital and separating transformation. Digital is adopting digital tools. Transformation is mindset. So I want to ask you, and you know, you touched upon, but I want to go in more details, is why is the mindset so important today in helping businesses shift systematically for a better future?
Yeah, thanks, Faisal. I mean, as I mentioned, I've been working in this space for 15 years now, and we've we've been able to make the case for it, but it just becomes so clear right now as we're facing uncertainty. So what you need is people in your organization that are really comfortable with the kind of situation that we're in right now, and we're seeing this with our global community. So entrepreneurs are very comfortable with uncertainty. You talk to an entrepreneur, they welcome it. They really love that we don't know. There isn't a roadmap. Like, they step into those spaces very confidently, very comfortably, in a way that not everybody does. So what you're seeing right now, we're interviewing entrepreneurs in our networks to get a sense of what's going on. They're the ones stepping up, and they're doing a lot of crisis management, which is quite interesting to see innovators move from their kind of more long-term view in developing the next business model into today's crisis management, because they're very capable of and comfortable, I would say, dealing with uncertainty. They also thrive in complexity. They understand the interconnections. So looking at these complex supply chains that we have, looking at the interconnections between healthcare and economic security and other issues, that they really understand how to kind of piece these things together. So that understanding of the interconnectedness. And I would say, I mean, this is something, it's a really difficult time for many people. And I wouldn't say that entrepreneurs are super heroes or superhuman. I don't mean to paint them that way, but I think they have focused a lot on their own personal resilience and their ability to be adaptable. So again, that they are kind of thriving in the conditions that we're faced right now. I think the last thing I would say about entrepreneurs is that we need to be working together. We need to be collaborating. We're seeing it across so many sectors and industries right now. And entrepreneurs are very adept at kind of finding and forging those unlikely collaborations, those alliances that we need in this moment. So I would say for those reasons, your entrepreneurs are really important employees in this moment, but also to shape what comes next. And sorry, I know I said that was final point, but I think like the what comes next is really important, because I think we're at risk right now of just bandaging over a lot of these problems and just saying, how do we patch it? How do we fix it? And really looking at not looking at the root causes of some of these issues. So why do we have, so I live in the US. We do not have a national health service. We have, a lot of people that go bankrupt because of the healthcare system. So there are a lot of underlying systemic challenges that need to be resolved when we build back a healthcare system that works for people. You can look at immigration challenges, inequity. There are these underlying root causes that entrepreneurs are good at spotting and really solving for, rather than just trying to band-aid over or sort of plaster over some of the challenges that we're facing in the moment.
And going on, some of the challenges, I want to take one of the questions that we have in the Q&A from Sana, because I think it's quite relevant to what we're talking about today. So do you think that companies need to revise constantly their business models to adapt to changes, knowing the complexity of the task?
Well, I mean, it's quite a big question, thinking across like all industries. I think what companies need to be very good at is spotting that next wave. So understanding like what is coming down the horizon, and not assuming that just because we've been in business for 100 years means we're going to be in business for the next 100. And you look at the automotive sector, right? It's like they could just assume we're going to go on making cars forever. But then their research is showing that kids aren't getting driver's licenses. Kids in Japan don't want to drive. So all of a sudden, and we're seeing it today, I think this is the thing, is that people have a hard time imagining really dramatic shifts. So we just kind of assume that this is going to go on, or it might shift or change incrementally. But what we're seeing now in this pandemic is stuff is stopped. 96% of air travel just grounded. This is something that we would have had a very hard time getting our heads around 2 months ago, but now we're seeing it. And if all of a sudden you have a generation of consumers that aren't buying cars or don't want to drive, what happens in the automotive sector? So these dramatic shifts can happen. And so what you need to be really doing is spotting those trends and understanding how that's going to impact your business. And so I'd say, again, just keeping with the automotive industry, that's a massive disruption for them. So what does their business model look like? And you'll see many of them are working with car sharing. They're looking at mobility solutions. They're forging partnerships with government around public transit. They're doing fleets, so there's a lot of this preparing for the next wave happening. But it really is about understanding, like, what are those trends that are going to potentially disrupt your business? And again, why intrapreneurs and also entrepreneurs, I know Faisal, you work with both. Those are really important people to have, not only in your networks, but to have a way of listening to them and to hearing and to understanding the implications of what they're seeing, and the implications for your business.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, exactly what we're seeing here today is that you have certain industries that are overexposed, certain industries that are benefiting in the boost, but really the true industries are the ones who have been building this for the past 5 to 8 years, right? This is not something that they decided, I'm going to start today and I'm going to benefit from. So I think it's quite important to always look at how do you actually spot your trends and how do you change? Because when crisis comes, it does provoke change.
It's so true, Faisal. I mean, what's been fascinating is in our conversations with entrepreneurs around the world, this isn't universal, but one of the trends we're seeing is the barriers have been dropping for them for many of the products and solutions they've been developing. So if you think about digital healthcare, all of a sudden there were so many barriers to that before. Now everybody needs it. And so there were entrepreneurs working on those solutions, but people weren't listening. Digital translation, we have a member who's a surgeon, and he'd been working on this digital translation product that he kept getting pushback for because they said, oh, well, that'll put our human translators out of business. We don't want AI coming in and disrupting this. They have so many patients they need to serve now. He's like, he's got demand for his product, and on the list of, digital access to this education product or what have you, that people have been working on, particularly your entrepreneurs have been working on, as you said, for maybe 8 years in the basement of your organization. And now the CEO is like, okay, where's that product? So, and often they're under-resourced, they're under-supported. So I think it is, how do we create a proactive innovation and entrepreneurship strategy, knowing that not all those things are going to be relevant. They're not all going to be successful, but man alive, when we come into a situation like this, you're ready. You've got something to respond with rather than being caught, we'd say flat-footed.
True. So before we jump into a question and talk about, what is the culture that you need for these entrepreneurs to foster, I want to go on, if you can give us another example other than M-Pesa. And I think M-Pesa was very interesting because as well, M-Pesa was targeting a market where your infrastructure was not there, right? So it did not show an incremental change. This was a leap. This was a leap of innovation. But can you give us other examples of other companies that have shown impact by embracing an entrepreneurial mindset?
Yeah, the one that comes to mind, I worked very closely with for a number of years. So GSK, a global pharmaceutical company, was headed for a number of years by a CEO called Andrew Whitty, who really understood this. Like, he really understood, first of all, that he needed to give people a bigger purpose than just making money. And he framed it as building trust. So, we'll come on to culture in a minute, but I think what's really important to understand is that they had a CEO that set the tone at the top. It said, our business success depends on our building trust with the communities and the stakeholders that we serve and interact with. So it was this framing, and he didn't then come in and say exactly what that looked like, but he created the frame for then people to innovate around. And the example I was thinking of when you asked me to kind of share was, I thought of this one because I wanted to showcase that entrepreneurship is not always about a new technology. So with like M-Pesa, it was this platform, as this kind of techie thing. This innovation I saw happening at GSK, I found really interesting. And basically what it was the head of emerging markets, a guy by the name of Abbas Hussein, who was looking again at entering these markets. They were, they were the growth markets for the healthcare industry. It was the end of the blockbuster drug. They were looking at where they were going to get more money, and it was, India, it was China. But what he realized is that we weren't going to be able to go into these markets with the same models and the same pricing that we were serving in our developed country markets. And so he busted a big taboo in the pharmaceutical industry around what they called tiered pricing. So the pharma industry had universal global pricing for all their medicines, cancer drugs, what have you. They were very worried that if they lowered a price for a country like India, that then India would buy that drug at the lower price and you would find it back in the US market. And so he really challenged a very strongly held industry norm about tiered pricing. And he said, look, we need to lower prices. We need to customize pricing for markets like India to get cancer medicines to the people who need them. Otherwise, we're only serving a very small fraction of the market. So what I just loved is it wasn't this like big technological invention, although they maybe needed some of that to make sure that drugs stayed in India and didn't come to the US. But at the end of the day, it was challenging this very powerful, entrenched kind of mindset and barrier to accessing those markets. So that was, for me, like one example of how, an intrapreneur, just came with a different approach, a different model for pricing that opened up all this access. And there are a number of stories, not just within GSK, but within the healthcare industry as well, whereas these entrepreneurs started looking at accessing these markets, they realized that a big barrier was just access to health systems altogether. And so you saw pharma getting beyond, just making drugs and medicine into actually developing robust health systems in markets that they were trying to serve. So those are entirely new business models. So that's one example, I say, of a company that, created that space for entrepreneurship.
Great. And building on the mindset, I think that's, I can see from a lot of the questions that we're already getting, more about the mindset and the culture. Like you said, I mean, it's about the mindset. It's not a job title or a seat in the C-suite, right? You really need to have the mindset internally. You really need to have this culture internally. So my question to you is, how do you build that culture of entrepreneurship internally? And what are the core competencies that are needed?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think, I can share a couple things. So one is we did some research about 2 years ago with the UK DFID and Business Fights Poverty and CEMEX and a couple of other organizations, which we can share with this group after, Faisal. But that we really kind of boiled it down to 4 things when you look at creating a culture of entrepreneurship and innovation. And the first, we did workshops around the world with different groups of entrepreneurs and executives. And the first thing that jumped out in every one of those workshops was the need to have a purpose that was bigger than profit. So this idea that Andrew Whitty had, it's about building trust. I know, Faisal, you mentioned your organization's really focused on the digital transformation, around serving customers. So it's, what is that motivating factor that is bigger than money? That's going to open up space. It's like, it's the sandbox, right? Like, what's that sandbox? What's that invitation you're making to people to get creative and to think about, what does that look like? If we're actually delivering on our purpose. And so it's a framing of that. It's a setting a tone at the top. But it's absolutely, if you do not have purpose beyond profit, you're really going to struggle to get entrepreneurs, because I think, as Faisal and Rasha both kind of indicated, entrepreneurs are not primarily motivated by money. They're motivated by purpose or motivated by solving wicked challenges. So that purpose, I would say, first and foremost, is incredibly important. And if you don't have it, that's where I would encourage you to spend some time. But of course, you can't deliver on your purpose without your people. And so there's a lot of research that's been done looking at how do you, recruit people, then how do you retain them, how do you reward and incentivize them. And if you look at, we've talked to entrepreneurs around the world, most companies have some sort of, performance review system. It often, what we hear is it's at odds with the way they work as an entrepreneur. They're not often measured on the things that, that they see as valuable in terms of like experimentation, in terms of collaboration. I was just reading this horrible article today about how companies are now monitoring their employees at home. There's like technology you can insert in your employee's laptop that tracks you. But what I found really interesting about this is it was gauging productivity by how often I was typing in my document or at my computer. Now, if you're talking about innovation and entrepreneurship, they're not going to be productive if they're answering emails. If you're creating new ideas, if you're developing new collaborations, you need space to think. You need, you should not be behind your desk. And so really thinking about how do we measure performance and how do we create reward mechanisms that support entrepreneurs is incredibly important. The other thing that came up in our research, I'm going to put it here in this conversation, kind of the elephant in the room, is power. Many companies, and Frederick Laloux has done really beautiful work in this space, looking at these structures of organization. and he kind of maps the evolution of our organizational structures according to kind of the evolution of human consciousness. And if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend, I think it's Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux. And so he talks a lot about power, and what he looks at is in most of our organizations, they're still distributed in a command and control style. So this is the military style where you have the generals at the top, you have the CEOs at the top, and it's everything comes from the top, and then it's, you know, trickle down. So the people at the bottom, first of all, who are closest to your customers, who probably have incredible insight and great ideas, are not empowered to actually do much with that. And so what he looks at is how do we kind of distribute authority and decision making more to the bottom and middle up. And what I love about his work is, first of all, he looks at it in very traditional industries like automotive, manufacturing, and healthcare. So sometimes I think when we talk about distributed power, we think, oh, well, you can only do that in, you know, Silicon Valley tech companies, you know, where everybody's, you know, a techie or something. This applies across the board to even very traditional industries, and just shows how powerful it is when you distribute power to people and you trust them and you give them the information to make good decisions and to actually innovate. And I would just, you know, leave with this story that an insurance company that I came across one time had been running these employee ideas competitions, and they said the best ideas and the greatest number of ideas came from one employee who was a security guard in the company. So you just don't know where good ideas can come from, and I think we need to you know, as leaders of organizations, really recognize that and sort of think about how do we share and distribute power. And the final thing we looked at, so it was the purpose, it was the people, it was the power, and the final thing was what we call pipeline. So having some formalized mechanisms. So I know, Faisal, you have an accelerator program. You know, many companies now have these kind of pipeline development mechanisms. So they have employee idea competitions, they have accelerators, you know, all sorts of things where, you know, how are you creating that pipeline of new ideas and moving them through some type of funnel so you're getting good, you know, new products at the outside.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. So I want to touch on, I mean, there's a lot of points there that, you know, we need to dive deeper into, but maybe I'll touch upon the second point when you talked about people, and I couldn't agree more. You know, equality in terms of allowing all employees to really be part of this innovation is vital. Again, this is your majority of your frontline employees. These are the ones that are right there where your customer is at, right? They know exactly what your customer needs. And I mean, if you look at Toyota, I mean, Toyota's real advantage was its ability to harness innovation through its employees. And a lot of Toyota's innovation actually came from its frontline employees. So on that note, I want to take as well a question that we have from Zara, which is, how can you spot intrapreneurs during the hiring process? And is there a certain methodology you recommend? I mean, if I open a resume, am I going to see an intrapreneur and that's how I'm going to hire someone?
Well, I'm not sure I can tell all my secrets, but no, I'm just kidding. It's such a great question. And people asked me this for years when I was working at the beginning of doing my research with the intrapreneurs. And, you know, if you talk to a venture capitalist, right, if you talk to these people who have invested in entrepreneurs for decades, they will say and have said to me, you know, you just spot them, you know them when you see them, kind of thing. They walk in a room, the way they talk. And I do think that's the true for intrapreneurs. But certainly you need to break it down more than that. And as I mentioned, we developed a tool, the League IQ, which breaks it down. Happy to kind of share more about that. But kind of questions that we've started asking, so this is one that I've really enjoyed, is asking somebody when they've stood up for something unpopular, right? So it's a very general question, but it gets at, like, am I comfortable, you know, putting new ideas out there that are going against the grain? Because that's basically what entrepreneurs are doing. Also, you know, there you can spot entrepreneurs, but also entrepreneurial talent. You know, so Faisal, I know you're an entrepreneur kind of coming in, so that's a really interesting way to recruit, is like bringing entrepreneurs inside. It's a struggle, I would say. Like placing an entrepreneur inside a big corporate is very challenging, but that's one way to get that kind of DNA in the organization. But certainly asking them, you know, when have you done it before? You know, looking for those kind of track record examples for folks. We do also ask, you know, what kind of entrepreneurial gifts do you think that you bring? And getting them just to elaborate a bit more on how they see it, I think is one way to spot Yeah, but certainly, I guess the entrepreneurs too will be networked with kind of other entrepreneurs. So that's a great way to say, like, who do you work with in big companies? There, it's a bit of a club. So.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you know, when you're looking for entrepreneurs, you shouldn't put all your focus on the resume, because the resume only gives you what that person has done in the past. It really doesn't show what the person wants to do or what the person wants to achieve. And I think I've learned that a lot when investing in entrepreneurs, is that, you know, you can have the best resumes of entrepreneurs who've attended, you know, Ivy League schools, but they may not have the spirit nor the resilience or the passion to really take this forward. So I think there needs to be a fine line of how much emphasis do you put on the resume, and like you said, how much do they actually look into the mentality and thinking.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, we talk often about, you know, shiny eyes. You know, there's something about, like, when you're starting to talk about like challenges and problems that need solving, you see them light up. And that's what I mean, is that, I mean, first of all, you have to speak to these people. You can't look at a piece of paper and get a sense of their entrepreneurial. You have to talk to them and see, like, what lights them up. You know, if it's about diving into those wicked challenges, you're pretty sure you're spotting an entrepreneur and intrapreneur.
Maybe on that, how is it different from entrepreneurs and startups? So if we take entrepreneurs, organizations, how different is it from entrepreneurs and startups?
Sure. I mean, I think what entrepreneurs have is a degree of patience with the existing system and an ability to navigate. I find entrepreneurs, I have friends that have tried to make that shift, and they've really struggled, because the pace of change is different, and the amount of people they need to convince that their idea is a good one is incredibly frustrating. So what we see when we look at entrepreneurs is it almost, I mean, 80% of it is about bringing people along. You know, it's very little about a new good idea, you know, because ideas are out there and you're maybe repurposing something that was already happening. You know, how do we have our, you know, next fintech product that's kind of looks like that thing out there. But what it is, you know, I need to understand, you know, who makes decisions in the organization. That may be explicit, it may be more implicit. So where does the power sit, and how do I influence those people? So if you look at the number of PowerPoint decks, you know, an entrepreneur will have for one idea, it's like, okay, I'm sitting with this person, this is what they care about. So, you know, you become, as an entrepreneur, kind of part psychologist, you know, part, you know, entrepreneur and inventor. But really, you know, how do you move that idea through an entrenched system? And that is, you know, a key difference. But also, like, the positive side, and why entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs do this inside, is because they can harness the assets of the organization. You know, so what entrepreneur wouldn't love to have the tech resources of your bank, Faisal, or the marketing team, or the branding, you know, all of that, and the reach. You know, when you talk to people that maybe worked at Walmart, to say, look, all of a sudden I can reach, you know, millions of people with my solution, my product, my service, whatever it is, because I'm working from within this big institution. So, you know, there are these trade-offs, but I would say that kind of internal diplomacy factor is a main distinguisher, for sure.
Mm-hmm. So as we talk about entrepreneurs, and, you know, we classify them as superheroes, people who are quite different in the organization, what type of environment is required for these entrepreneurs to flourish?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so I would say, okay, well, they need lots of space, and they need, you know, creativity and all this. At the same time, when I think about this question, what are the things that, like, entrepreneurs thrive because there are these constraints? So I think sometimes I think we should, you know, of course you want to drop the barriers to it. You don't want to make it so hard, but I do think there's something about the constraints that motivate entrepreneurs. You know, it's almost like, you tell me no, I'll show you, you know, so that's a little bit of that, where maybe if it's too, like, open and supportive, you know, maybe entrepreneurs wouldn't be so hungry. But yeah, that said, I mean, I think it is, you know, getting out of this kind of siloed working. And so, do we have a culture that understands that it's about working across these silos? And so often what, you know, you hear entrepreneurs say is like, oh, well, you know, that somebody said that wasn't my job. as I work here, I have a particular function. So I think within a company, if you're looking at like, how do I create more enabling environments? Like, how do I help and encourage working across not only silos within my company, but working, outside of my organization. And I remember, I was at an innovation workshop in a unnamed big bank in London, and this young woman came to it, and we were talking about intrapreneurship and innovation, and she was super excited. And she, super talented young woman, had these digital technology skills she was bringing to the bank. And so I, was having this conversation with her, and she said, "My boss doesn't know I'm here." I wasn't allowed to tell my boss I was coming to a company-sponsored event on innovation and intrapreneurship. She wasn't allowed to leave her desk. You know where that woman works now? She left. She works at Google. So this is real. This is what happens if you don't give people permission to, literally leave their desks in some cases, right? To go and to pick their head up and to see what's going on. And what I loved, I remember talking to a former entrepreneur from Syngenta, and he had been running this, kind of multi-billion-dollar business for them. And he said, he always kind of asked himself as a leader, am I creating space for my employees and my innovators, or am I taking up space? So by that he meant, like, if I take up space, I'm telling them what to do. I'm micromanaging them. I'm not trusting them. I'm not distributing power. If I'm creating the space, I'm giving them permission. And I would share one other example that I really enjoyed when we were interviewing Salesforce, and an entrepreneur there who said, my boss asked me for 20 new ideas a week. Right? That's a very simple thing. You don't need a big culture change program. You don't need an accelerator program. You literally just need to ask people for new ideas. And you know what? They'll bring them, So I thought that was a really sweet, just small thing as a manager or leader you can do, is just ask for new ideas. And that says so much to people about, what you care about and that you value their ideas.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Creating an environment where these people can just go work on their own ideas, where the toxic antibodies can't really attack them, right? They're somewhat protected, that way enabling them to flourish. But maybe even when you create that environment, some of the challenges that I've seen working with other organizations and with startups is that you still need to reinvent the process that governs that work.
Yeah.
And how do you tackle this? I mean, because if you look at our organization's internal policies and procedures, these have not changed for the past 100 of years. And if true innovation needs to happen, I think that's the first place where it needs to be tackled. So, I mean, how do you see that happening? Have you seen, from your experience, organizations who have tackled that, and how have they tackled that?
Well, I think it happens in different ways. So, Gib Bullock, who was Accenture, set up their nonprofit consulting arm called Accenture Development Partnerships, famously quoted as, if I'm not breaking a rule like every day, I'm kind of not doing my job. So there is a bit of that. I think we have to be careful, especially in regulated industries. Like, rules are there for reasons, and so we've seen, I would say, entrepreneurship of the not so very good kind in financial services. So, you don't want to be encouraging employees to break rules that are in place. At the same time, there are gray areas, there's bending of rules. One story I heard within Nike was quite interesting. They wanted to work to get young people submitting shoe designs. But of course, working with young people, it comes with a whole lot of legality, reaching out to minors and getting them involved in commercial activity. But it was a great idea, right? Like, here are the kids that are buying your sneakers. They're often coming from low-income communities, inner cities, minority youth. So here's a group of people that, how awesome to start getting them involved in shoe and footwear design, maybe creating career pathways for them. So this was an intrapreneurial idea, but had a lot of legal barriers. And so they went to the legal team at Nike and said, how can you help us make this happen? And the feedback from the lawyer was, I've never been asked that kind of a question before. I've never been invited to be part of an innovation team to actually make something possible. I'm always being told to shut stuff down. I'm always being told to manage risk. And of course, your legal team, that's what they should be doing for the most part, but they are human too, and they get excited when they're invited to do things that have purpose and meaning. And so I guess I would just say is, can you find your intrapreneurs or more supportive allies in these process divisions who can help you think through, how do we do this in a way that doesn't, create risk for the organization, but enables this opportunity while also managing the risk. But yeah, it requires finding those special allies in the system.
Which I guess, I mean, they're your intrapreneurs in one way or another. They're your change agents, champions, who are going to help you and push you along the way. Going back to the points that you mentioned, you touched upon the tools and resources that intrapreneurs need. So how do you enable these within the environment? So how do you enable an environment to really rapid prototype, test business models, and get feedback from customers?
Well, first of all, like the biggest barrier to intrapreneurs is time. So when you think about environments, if people have no spare time, and I look at organizations, I mean, even companies, so Salesforce as a company, I would hold out as saying, I think they've done a lot of things right. Mark Benioff has absolutely set a tone of purpose at the top. They created, Salesforce.org, which is a space to do a lot of their impact work, so great things. And at the same time, when you talk to employees at Salesforce, they are scheduled, meetings from like 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. They're like, where is the time to create? Where is the time to innovate? And I think that's just one example. I mean, not to pick on them, but if you just look at your organization, like, do people have any free time? So, again, I think that's just something is really thinking about time. I think also then finding intrapreneurs and creating what we call communities of practice. So I think sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming. I know I get overwhelmed to think about top-down big culture change programs to make this happen. I don't think it needs to work like that. I think what you do is you find your intrapreneurs that are the bottom of the organization and you help them to thrive and you connect them with people. And so it becomes this kind of bottom up, almost, I use the metaphor of like an ink blot. On a piece of paper, you put your ink and then it starts to spread, and then you have another one over here and it starts to spread. So if you see intrapreneurs as this like spreading positive infection, to use that metaphor in the moment, but if they're positively infecting other people, so they're inviting folks to be part of their team. I really love that idea. And so like you think of the lawyer, right, at Nike. So you had the intrapreneur who invited the lawyer in. Now she's got that entrepreneurial mindset. Then she might be doing things differently. So if you really just look at it as, I think this is maybe terrible, but we can learn a lot from the pandemic about how contagion spreads. And if you think about this in the most positive way, like how do we spread that entrepreneurial mindset from the bottom of the organization up? And so I think it is about finding, celebrating, connecting those intrapreneurs with wider teams, and then giving them time. One thing, Adobe has created this thing called Kickbox, which has been really effective for them. So it's basically innovation in a box. Anybody can apply to get it, and it comes with a toolkit, a training, and a gift card that has like, I don't know, $1,000 on it or something. So you can, create a mini website, or you get, so you get a little bit of startup capital. I mean, it's not much, but it allows you to do something. And what they reported, they've written a detailed case study on this, is that the return on that investment, they've gotten more ideas for lower cost than what they were getting through a very centralized innovation function. So those kinds of tools can be really simple, just to provide a little bit of kind of training and guidance and support. And if you then pair that with a community of practice, right? So the intrapreneurs coaching each other and learning with each other to do that, that's an incredibly effective way to create enabling environments for intrapreneurs.
Yeah, and like you said, when it comes to time to market, I guess, this is a metric now organizations really need to monitor, is how soon can you get your product into market, especially when we're living in times where market is quite changing. But I think when you also look at the time to market, I think what's important, like you said, is really implementing the right tools and resources and doing that discovery stage. And somewhat what I've seen with other organizations out there is that, they sacrifice the discovery stage, right? They focus more on the business case on the Excel sheet, but really there isn't much done on the interview and understanding what their customer wants. And I think what a great quote by Albert Einstein really summarizes this, is that if you were given 1 hour to save the planet, you would spend 59 minutes defining the problem and 1 minute resolving it. I think that's vital. It's vital that, you know, they need to focus more on understanding who the customer is, what does the customer want, and how do you take that approach to the customer going forward.
It is so true, Faisal. I mean, we see this over and over, and just companies, and they know it too. I mean, I think this is the other thing, is they talk about how isolated, how insular we are, but to really get out, you know, from behind the desk, from behind the organization, and to immerse yourselves with customers. And if you look at, I guess Cemex developed a housing product to help their cement company in Mexico, and there was an entrepreneur who basically was flying home, you know, one day, and like flying over all these shanty towns outside Mexico City, and just saw the incredibly impoverished conditions that people were living in, and thought, wait a minute, you know, we work in the construction sector. Isn't there something we can do? But to your point, instead of like just offering them more cement or whatever it was, you know, he went and lived for weeks with the communities in these neighborhoods to understand, you know, what is it that they really want. And it was so interesting because he said what he heard was that they had a dream of home ownership, you know, that these people just wanted their own home. And this was a very real dream. So it was like really understanding that, you know, these people are incredibly poor. They have very little, but they have dignity, and they have hope, and they have dreams. And so that lit it up for him. And then they created this program at Cemex that worked with architects to provide these very basic, you know, housing structures, but allowed people in that community to own their own homes. So, but it wasn't, he wouldn't have come there, right? It would have been maybe a job training program or something, you know, that they thought the community needed, instead of really embedding himself and his team with the community to listen to their hopes and dreams, and then designing a solution for that.
Mm-hmm. So going on the point that you talked about, you know, the different programs that exist there, from, you know, innovation labs to accelerators, and how co-creation and open innovation is. I want to get to the more broader question of, you know, even with all these programs, what are the biggest challenges for companies integrating these programs in the organization? So what is generally entrepreneurs always facing? What are the challenges?
It is, it's what I talked about with Nick. It's this kind of shared mindset of the business that we're in. And I'll give you another example, kind of coming back to automotive, because we've worked a bit with BMW Group and know some entrepreneurs there. And, you know, there's a reason. I think this is the other thing, is you can't necessarily blame people for this. They join a company because of what it stands for and because of what they think it is. You know, so for Nike is really interesting. People join because of the love of sport. So if Nike all of a sudden moves away from sport, you just have, you know, 50,000 people who have joined a company because they believe in this thing. So you have to be very careful as you're making these shifts to bring people along. In the case of BMW, you know, as we're moving to the electrification of vehicles, the folks that join, you know, it's about the love of driving, right? So I joined BMW Group because I love driving. That's their whole marketing thing. You know, people join because they love, I mean, not everybody, but many people join because they love cars, they love driving. And so if you look at the development of the electric vehicle, that in some people's mind can signal the end of that. Like, no longer is driving fun. We're trying to solve climate change. These cars are slower. They're, you know, they don't go very far, you know, so there's this whole sense that, you know, the reason I joined this company is shifting. And so that can be a real barrier to people getting on board. And what I love with the story of BMW Group is they sense this. They sense that engineers were really reluctant to make the shift from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles. So they set up a test drive day, and they basically got a whole bunch of electric vehicles. They rented out a racetrack, and they brought 200 engineers to come and actually drive these cars firsthand, and to see that driving electric vehicles could be fun. So they really cracked that cultural and mental barrier that people had to help bring them along. So I would say that is the biggest barrier is, you know, how does this link to what I thought the business was? And I think the solution to that is exactly what this BMW team did, is invite people to experience it, to understand the need for the shift and to be a part of owning it rather than feeling, sidelined or marginalized. I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but it's definitely what you need to be thinking about all the time as an intrapreneur, is especially if you're out here in this siloed unit, this satellite unit, this skunkworks thing, someday you're going to need to bring that back in. And so the further out here in space you are, the harder that's going to be.
Agreed. And maybe just on the challenges, I want to address one challenge, which is failure, right? Innovation requires a high appetite of risk. It really calls for sacrificing predictability for possibility. And with possibility comes a lot of failure. So how do organizations, and large organizations where, failure is somewhat frowned upon to talk about, how do they embrace failure? And how should they go about it?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think it's human nature. I don't think we don't want to fail. I don't want to fail, right? But if you normalize it and you acknowledge that it's part of the journey, and that we know it will be part of the journey, that it's not coming out of here, then I think there are a few things. You can manage how it happens. So you can be tracking it to say, okay, well, what are these milestones? How do we know, if we're off track or on track? But I remember hearing this story. I was at an innovation conference, and this guy was talking about his boss had this wall of failure, with all these Post-it notes kind of describing the various failures that had happened around the organization. I thought, oh, that's such a great idea. Celebrate it and call it out. Remember that one. So I was about to say, oh, what a wonderful thing your boss did to just kind of name it, make it visible. He said, oh no, all those people were fired. So it was the exact opposite of what I thought, was happening, which was let's celebrate failure. So that's real, right? That culture still exists where we get fired because we fail. I mean, I'd love to hear, Faisal, how you're managing it in your organization, because I think it's a tricky balance. My nervousness is that we have these terms now where it's I think you even use it. It's successful learning. We've stopped using the language of failure, which I think on one hand can be helpful, but on the other hand, if it just then doesn't, if we're not really accepting that failure is part of this, I'm not sure that that's addressing the issue. So what are you seeing at the bank?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one, you need to reword it. You can't be walking around and saying failure. You need to say successful learnings. And I think people need to accept that sunk cost is not a total failure. Right? Killing a project is a brave thing, and really coming out and saying, you know what, this has not worked. And because it has not worked, I was able to kill it before it increased the risk or financial cost on me. That is definitely needed. Now, I think when people think about successful learnings and failure, it's important to acknowledge one thing: tolerance for failure, but not tolerance for incompetency. That's vital.
Yeah.
When you explore risky ideas, ultimately it's fine to fail, but mediocre technical skills, sloppy thinking, bad work habits, and poor management are not. Yeah. And that should not really be associated. And I think that's somewhat the perception that people need to separate in one way or another. And you need to clearly differentiate between productive and unproductive failures. Productive failures is yielding valuable information relatively to the cost. And that's where you go out and celebrate. However, if you failed with incompetencies and you have not received any, then maybe I go with the point that the person made on firing. Maybe that's too extreme. But maybe at that stage, it doesn't make more sense. An example I've seen larger organizations, other organizations, in the Western world do, which was quite interesting, is a chance pass, where you allow someone to take that risk and you allow him to get a pass. However, if they make the same mistake again, you scrutinize them. And the interesting part of it is if they don't utilize that chance pass, then you take it from them. And you basically scrutinize them again because they didn't take that risk. So they didn't really infuse into that intrapreneurial mindset. I haven't tried it yet, but I mean, that was just
I think that's such a great idea, though. I love little hacks like that. And actually, we have a member of the league set up this, I won't say the full name because it's a swear word, but this F-up night or failure night, I guess. But it's a global movement where they do evening presentation. Well, it doesn't have to be in the evening, but they have presentations where people share their failures, and it literally is a celebration of failure. And it's so beautiful because it's part of the human condition, you know, and it is part of the innovation journey. And to bottle it up and to say that you're less than because you failed, you know, has a huge psychological toll on your employees. And so if you can bring it out of the shadows, and I love it, give them a chance pass, or do a, you know, failure night celebration where it's like, we're going to celebrate this, but also celebrating, like you said, what is good failure? And it's good failure is failure where we learn and we play that learning forward. And I guess the final thing about failure is, you know, it hurts less if you've invested less in it, which is why entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs are so focused on what we call minimum viable products. So you don't build the full solution with all the bells and whistles to get out to market to have it fail. You build the smallest possible version of that to test your hypotheses, to test your solution, and then, you know, look at it, you know, if it doesn't work, it wasn't a big investment risk for you.
Exactly. And I mean, this is one thing that we've taken internally is lower the governance for budget requests for innovation teams. However, increase the number of budget rounds and decrease the budget allocated. So if someone is looking for $50,000, allow them to capture that $50,000 and easily ask for it, but basically divide that 50 on different milestones and reduce the amount. Let the intrapreneur think about every dollar that they need to spend and how they're going to effectively spend it. That's where the MVP component comes to it. And at the same time, as management, you lower the risk of losing a big investment, and you have more chances in re-evaluating and killing a project if necessary. And I think killing a project, you know, people may think it's huge, but I think, you know, it's quite normal. It's part of the life cycle. You either scale, kill, or pivot. And I don't think there's anything more than can go in that aspect, but it's part of that. I want to jump into, you know, we talked about the environment. We talked about what do we need from entrepreneurs. And something that you talked about is the rewards, right? So how do you incentivize, so how can leaders incentivize and motivate their employees to participate and really discover their journey of entrepreneurism?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it comes back to recognizing your role as the leader or leaders of the organization is in setting that culture and tone from the top. I mean, the first thing I would say is entrepreneurs don't need a lot of financial incentive and they don't need a lot of incentive. I mean, your entrepreneurs they're motivated by solving problems. You know, they're highly intrinsically motivated individuals. If you want a wider group of employees to participate who maybe don't have yet that fire in the belly or, you know, haven't built those muscles yet, what they are going to need from the leadership is permission. Okay. They are not going to take that themselves. We were talking about this in one of our prep calls of how many people and employees maybe have an idea, but they are too scared to step forward with it because they think they might be penalized, punished, or fired. You know, so as leader of the organization, you know, you can signal this in lots of different ways. You do your town halls, you know, however you're communicating with your employees, inviting them to be proactive and to submit those ideas. Another thing you can do is to celebrate stories of entrepreneurship. So if you know, so our culture, any culture, you know, if you live in Jordan and you have your own culture there, I'm from Oregon, we have our culture here, you work in a bank, you have your culture there. It's about the stories that we tell ourselves, right? Our culture is formed through our stories. What are the stories that we're telling in our company? What are the stories we're celebrating? And are those entrepreneurial stories? So that's one thing that you can do, is to, you know, set the tone at the top, tell those stories. And then I would say the final thing is, you know, sitting in the leadership group of your organization is to think about the line managers. So one of the biggest barriers for entrepreneurs is often their direct boss. And it's not because their boss is a bad person that doesn't get it, but their boss has very specific metrics that they're trying to manage to. So if I'm an entrepreneur, you know, so Faisal's got a unique unit that's dedicated to innovation, but a lot of entrepreneurship is happening within the business, you know, that has existing targets. So if I'm coming to my boss with a new, maybe crazy idea, this kind of new thing I want to do, like the natural thing to do if you're managing that person is think, oh my gosh, like this is going to get us off track. This is a risk. This is, I am not incentivized to give this person space to create this new thing. And in fact, this person may make me look bad. So it requires a lot of courage and sometimes risk-taking on behalf of that mid-level management to create space for entrepreneurs. So there's a whole question there as a leadership team you should be asking is, how are we enabling our management team to create space for innovation and for entrepreneurship? What are we measuring? What are we signaling? So that's just a few things I would say as leaders of the organization that you can be thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Leaders need to play a more an active role. This is not something that that is top down, and then leaders basically put in their frontline employees. They need to be there, part of the journey, and pushing it. And on that, I think we talked about this a little bit, but I want to add more emphasis and really add this for the entrepreneurs out there. So how should entrepreneurs rally to get that support and to motivate? How should they find those open doors? And especially at times where the people that are working with them don't generally report to them. So there could be also a challenge there. So how should they go about this?
Well, we are just about to publish a book for entrepreneurs on this very thing. So I'd love if we can share that with this group after. It should be on Amazon in the next month. And one of the things we talk about in the book is we use a journey metaphor. So imagine you're an entrepreneur and you're kind of setting off on this journey, and there's this unknown destination. And a lot of it is about timing. So am I journeying in the middle of winter? This is an interesting time to be an entrepreneur. So gauging the kind of weather conditions in your organization. My company's laying off a whole bunch of people. Is this a great time to be stepping up and suggesting a new idea? So really understanding and kind of sensing the context and the timing and how favorable are the conditions for your new idea. But to your point, then, what we found through our research is a single key factor to success for entrepreneurs is, did they have a champion for their idea, right? Did they have a fairy godmother or godfather who took them under their wing and gave them what we would call air cover, right? So protected them for a lot of the negative resistance that you feel when driving change in an organization. So find that person. If you don't have that person, go around and just start having coffee with people and sharing, informally your idea to see who sits up and takes an interest. But really finding that person that's in an influential role in the organization to champion you is super important. As I talked about before, as part of the entrepreneur's mindset, what you're trying to do as an entrepreneur is kind of build a bridge for people who are they're firmly in today's reality. And you see this brighter future possibility that's so exciting and it's so clear to you. But you need to help migrate people from today's reality to that tomorrow's possibility. One way you can do that is through compelling storytelling and presentations, but a very effective way to do that is through what we call prototypes. So bringing it to life, showing it in reality. It doesn't mean building out the whole solution, but just how do you give people a sense of what does that actually look like? So it could be a small customer experience that they participate in. It could be like this racetrack thing that the BMW folks did. It could still be a presentation, but where you mock up what the solution would look like. So it really brings it to life for people. So as an entrepreneur, I would really focus on, how do you move from just this great idea to testing it in the real world and showing that customers are willing to pay for it. That's the biggest thing. That's what Nick Hughes did at Vodafone. He went with this startup money from DFID and he got customers buying the solution. Nothing speaks, stronger to decision makers than customers paying for a product. So if you can go and test it in a small way, that's great. And the final thing I would say is, as entrepreneurs who are listening, is absolutely find your community. Don't do this on your own. There's no lone wolf here. It's about finding your community within, but also, across organizations. The League of Entrepreneurs is one community. There are others, but don't do this on your own. There's so many people that you can be learning from and with.
Great. So there's a question here from Lauren, and it's a build-up on what we were talking about here. So in rolling out a new tech product within this market that is digital and transformational, what are the key considerations to keep in mind to ensure that your team is moving along with this change? Not all employees and team members are entrepreneurs. So I think to that question is, do you need a full team of entrepreneurs to make a project happen? Do you need a full room of cooks to make this project live?
I would say kind of two answers to that question. I would say one is absolutely you don't want the whole team to be like entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs. It's really nice, and we started doing some research on like team dynamics, but you absolutely want a bit of a blend, because if you have too many people, again with our League IQ, you know, there are people that are way out, like 99% entrepreneurial. They struggle sometimes to connect things back to the business. So you do also want a mix on that team. It's healthy. The other thing I hear though is about your communication plan. So it's interesting, you know, if you just think about your solution and customers and getting it to market, you're going to miss the very important job of managing your stakeholder groups. So what we encourage people to do is, you know, kind of plot your stakeholders on a 2x2 matrix, identify those really priority stakeholders, and then think about what is our communication plan. And for some entrepreneurs, quite frankly, early stage, it's kind of quiet. You might not say a whole lot because you're just trying to get some data. You're trying to prove that this thing, so you don't want to make it too visible. So that's a bit under the radar. But then once you start coming out, you know, people are going to be looking for progress. And so I think Faisal is really interesting. You talk about milestones, especially when you're working on disruptive innovation. You know, your success might be talk about electric vehicles, that's decades and decades down the road till they're really seeing traction. So what are those small wins that you can show along the way that keep people interested, engaged, and show that you're making progress?
Great, Maggie. Thank you very much. I do apologize for all the participants. I really didn't take into consideration the time. This has been quite an engaging conversation. However, what we'll do is we'll be sharing your questions with Maggie. That way, Maggie can respond back to you and really emphasize more on what you'd like to know. I hope that we were able to, and you know, I give more props to Maggie. I did the easy part. My part was just really delivering the questions. But Maggie, thank you very much for really giving us your insights and showing us ways of how we can become more entrepreneurials in our organizations and how we can motivate our employees and our leaders to take that initiative. And on that, I'll pass it on to Rasha for the closing.
Oh, and sorry, I forgot to mention, just for those that wanted to learn more, we are hosting Global Intrapreneur Week, June 8th through the 12th. So if you go to intrapreneurweek.net, and hopefully, Rasha, we can send something out. But just if you want to send your employees to a bunch of free resources, middle of June, we're hosting this global week, virtual week. But over to you, Rasha. Thank you for the plug.
Great. I guess there's no closing from Rasha's side. Just want to say thank you, everyone. Thank you, UNDP, for really making this happen. I hope everyone has enjoyed this. And Maggie, again, thank you for your insights.
This is great. I enjoyed it, Faisal. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.